can make this from scratch cheaper than buying it in the store. This week, we are going to be looking into baking mixes. Recently, I purchased a box of brownies and I was interested to see the ingredients that were on that box. A couple of things that had been added that I wasn't super excited about feeding to my family. So I thought, well, I could just make this from scratch. It'll probably even save money. Well, I didn't know if it really would. So we're going to look into this. We're going to look into 3 different baking items. We're going to do chocolate chip cookies. I made these last night, as well as a homemade version. A cake with frosting. I will do a homemade version of this as well. And then some brownies. We'll see a homemade version of those. So we're going to look at making these from scratch to see the raw ingredients equivalent to the box, how much that would cost. And then I will have my family blind taste them and give us a rating to see which they like better. I'm not going to tell them which is which. I'll have them give a rating, and then I will share that with you at the end of each recipe. So let's see how this turns out.
First up, we are going to look at chocolate chip cookies, so homemade versus a mix. So I bought a store mix and just dumped that in the bag. The ingredients call for a stick of butter or margarine. I'm using margarine for this recipe, and then just 1 egg, and those are the ingredients. Pretty easy, and just mix those up with a spoon. I didn't use a mixer, obviously, because the chocolate chip cookies are already in the mix, and so I didn't want to crush those up. And then I wanted to get an idea of how many this made, so I put them on a cookie sheet. I used a scooper so that the size is pretty even, and then I just popped those into the oven and then took those out when they were done, and then moved on to the homemade version. So lots of ingredients in here. I pre-prepped everything by putting it in little bowls, so you guys didn't have to watch me go get everything. I'm using margarine in this recipe as well. And this was for the quantity I was making, it ended up being half of a normal chocolate chip cookie recipe. So everything is cut in half from a normal recipe from like a cookbook. It's one favorite recipe that I have, pretty basic chocolate chip cookies. So dry ingredients are going together. I mix those in a bowl separately just to make sure that the baking soda and salt are evenly distributed, a little bit of vanilla, and then the dry ingredients into the wet ingredients, and then I mix these up. And then 1 cup of chocolate chips, so the quantity matched the store-bought mix. And then once again, just use the scoop to get even sizes and put those on a cookie sheet, and into the oven they went. And so those were cooking up, and then took those out. And here we have the 2 sheets side by side. On the cost, the first thing we looked at was the chocolate chip mix. So 99 cents, 28 cents for an egg, 36 cents for the stick of margarine. So not bad, pretty cheap ingredients. And the total for that batch was $1.63. And then moving on to the homemade version, obviously a lot more ingredients. They seem to be really cheap. And so I thought I was doing pretty good. The vanilla was a little bit expensive at 48 cents for that teaspoon, but everything else was cheap. But the chocolate chips, that's where it got me, because they were $1.82 for 1 cup of chocolate chips. So that totally made it more expensive at $3.49 for that batch. But then what about taste? So by far the homemade version was much, much better than the mixed version. The family ate the homemade version, and I think that the mixed version, some of those just went stale, and I ended up throwing them away. They weren't near as good as the homemade version. But if you're on a budget, there's nothing wrong with the mix. It was really cheap. If you're really craving chocolate chip cookies, that would be cheaper than buying maybe a pack of Chips Ahoy. So it's a win in the budget category, but homemade version is definitely a win in the taste category. Moving on to cake mixes. So I decided to make a yellow cake with some chocolate frosting. Starting with a store mix, I just bought a Pillsbury golden butter cake mix. So obviously put the cake mix in the bowl, and then it just really required just a couple of ingredients, some water, some eggs, just pretty standard. A little bit of butter. I guess that's a little bit unique. Usually it will have oil in it, but a little bit of butter. I use margarine in this one. And then just mixed it. I just followed the instructions, nothing special on this. And then I decided to make this into some cupcakes, just easier to eat. And someone in the family had asked for cupcakes, so I'm like, okay, cool, I'll make some cupcakes. So I made 24 cupcakes, and I just divided that up in the muffin pans or cupcake pans, and then I put that into the oven and baked it just as the box had said. I followed the instructions. And then once those were done, I took those out to start cooling, and I used the store-bought chocolate frosting. This is actually Betty Crocker frosting, and I just frosted those cupcakes. And I had enough to frost all 24 of them, and maybe a little bit extra, but not really. It just was a decent amount of frosting on each cupcake. So that's what I did for the store-bought mix, just standard, and I set that aside. And then I went to make my homemade version of the cake and the frosting. So making a homemade version, lots of ingredients. So I did a little bit of prep work and got some stuff prepared. I used a recipe from an old Betty Crocker cookbook, so it had some ingredients we don't use as often today in the cake and the frosting. Like I started out with some Crisco. We don't use that very often. Other than that, it was pretty standard ingredients. I just followed the instructions. Mixing the dry ingredients in a separate bowl, and then, wet and dry mixed together. I noticed that in these older recipes that they must have had a lot more time, because there was a lot of extra steps that it seems like have just been cut out today. And I had to mix it for like 5 minutes to get it nice and whipped up. And then I put it just in a pan. I'd already made cupcakes, so this time I just made a cake. I wasn't sure if we were going to eat it or if I was going to freeze it. So anyways, put it in a 9 by 13 pan, put that in the oven, and then that was done. And so I set that aside to cool a little bit while I moved on to making my homemade frosting. And I've made homemade frosting many times. I do it with a really simple recipe, but I followed the recipe that was in the cookbook with the cake. So it was a little bit of a different recipe than I had normally made. So powdered sugar, which is in my normal recipe. And then cocoa powder, of course, because it is a chocolate frosting that I was making. And then from there, the ingredients were interesting because it required oil, vanilla, that's pretty normal. And then a little bit of water, and mix that all up. And it was surprising. It took a while to mix up, but then it ended up being very fudgy. And so then I added some margarine to that. I mixed that up, and so it softened it up a little bit, got a little bit more frosting like. And then it had an egg in it, which I've never added an egg to frosting, and I wasn't quite sure. It is raw, so I knew I had to keep it in the fridge for this recipe because it's not cooked. It is a raw egg. But I will tell you, that is the best frosting I have ever made. So once the cake was cooled, I frosted the cake, and then I cut a little piece so you guys could see what the homemade version of it looked like. Now let's look at the cost comparison of the two. So first up was that store mix. It was just a cake mix, some water, 3 eggs, and then some butter. So those were the 3 ingredients that it required. And so that ended up being $2.31 with all the ingredients. Now for the homemade version, lots of ingredients. Some of them weren't too bad, but some of them were kind of expensive. And so for the homemade version, that actually cost $5.07 for the cake. And then the store frosting was $1.96. And then the homemade version of the frosting, also lots of ingredients. Some of them were kind of expensive. So the total for that was $3.57. Now, what about taste? Well, we were kind of mixed on this. The cake was better from the mixed version, but the frosting was better from homemade. So it was mixed reviews on that. But if we're looking at cost, the homemade version was $8.64, almost double that of the store mix. So in this case, the store, buying it from the store in those mixes is a way better deal than making it from the homemade version. The homemade version took a lot longer. It was a lot more ingredients. It's totally worth just buying the mix. The last thing I compared was brownies. So I looked at homemade versus using a mix. So I started with a Betty Crocker dark chocolate brownie mix, and I just followed the instructions. It really requires only a couple of ingredients, some oil, some eggs, and a little bit of water to the mix. And so I just got that all mixed up, and then I put that into the oven. And then once those were going, I made the homemade brownie mix. So like the cake, I used an old-fashioned recipe from probably like the 50s or something. So a lot of ingredients, starting with some cocoa and Crisco, melting that in a saucepan. This was like a lot of extra work, it seemed to me, but the chocolate that it was melting, it smelled really, really good. I'm like, okay, this is going to be a rockin' recipe. So I melted that, I set it aside, and then moved on to adding the other ingredients into a bowl while that kind of cooled down. So again, lots of ingredients. Once that was cooled off, I mixed it in together, and then I moved on to the dry ingredients. It doesn't take a lot of, flour or anything like that. It does have a lot of liquid ingredients, so just a few dry ingredients, put those together, mixed them up, made a disaster on the countertop, and then pour those into a pan and put those in the oven as well. That batter smelled really good, and so I thought those would turn out really good. And so then I had two versions. I had the mixed version and the homemade version. So let's look at it. So the cost on the homemade version, so I mentioned it was quite a few ingredients. We started with some, the Crisco, the cocoa powder, baking powder, oil, all these different ingredients, and it didn't seem like they were really adding up to that much. Salt was a penny, the flour was 11 cents, so it didn't seem like it was that much, but it ended up being $3.74, so I didn't think that it was that bad. And then moving on to the mix, $1.68, some water was free, oil, some eggs, and so the mix ended up being $2.97, so a little bit cheaper. But let's talk about taste. So the mixed version by far was way better than the homemade version. The homemade version ended up being really dense. It was probably just the recipe I chose. It wasn't that great. And then on the cost, the mixed version was $2.97. The homemade version was $3.74. The mixed version won on this as well. So overall, I would say that the brownie mix is a total win. It's cheaper, it's faster, it tastes better. It was a lot moister. It was so much faster than all of the steps in the homemade version. So on this one, mix wins it all the way.
Well, now we're all on a sugar high from eating baked goods all week. I honestly had to put some of that stuff in the freezer because it was just too much to eat all at once. So I was quite surprised how that turned out. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. Leave me a comment below. Let me know what you think. If there's anything else you'd like me to test out, store-bought versus a homemade version, I'd love to do it. Just let me know.